Hey, you and I, we're going to be taking a look in the next few weeks at why God allows suffering. There is a good God. Why does he allow bad things to happen? And we're going to be looking at a story in which God allows a good man to suffer. And we're going to try to make sense of the whole thing. Like, why would God allow that to happen? Now, the story is about a man named Job. And we're going to see that even though God is all loving and all merciful, that love and mercy can sometimes come to us in the midst of pain and suffering. And, it's an uncomfortable thought. But sometimes truth is just like that. I mean, I think of a time where I took a bunch of high schoolers to the Philippines. And man, the Philippines is an amazing place. It's a very hot place. I mean, it's just like super humid and you see so much. I mean, the whole culture there is completely different. We took a bunch of these high schoolers to a community called the Bajau Muslims. And it was interesting because the way this community was set up, you had a Muslim community that was kind of surrounding this tiny little Christian community. And the missionaries that came to this place had actually done this amazing thing with this school. And in this school, it was like, man, God was doing these incredible things for this community of these young people and how they had just been so touched and changed by the love and the mercy and the grace of this Christian community compared to what was going on in the Muslim community around it. It was a sea village type of rickety type of thing where you had to go out on all these piers, and it was kind of like almost like Fear Factor where you're like scared you're going to fall through. And on your way there were kids everywhere. I mean, like they were all over the place. It was They looked a lot like, almost like when you watch the movie Jungle Book, Mowgli, he's like jumping all over the place. Kids were jumping everywhere. Hair was all crazy. Their eyes were all red because the water was polluted. And on the way there, it was almost like we've been overrun. If you ever walked into maybe like an elementary school where everybody's like, hey, like, I want to talk to you. These kids were everywhere, and they all called us Joe. Like that was the thing in the Philippines, is that you call every American Joe, and it was kind of from the World War II where they called people G.I. Joe, like all the troops there, and so they just still called Americans Joes. And so these kids were like, Joe, 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 and they jump from like house to house. They're like climbing up on stuff and they jump off houses into the water. The water's like 3-4 feet deep because the tide was going out, and they're calling for us to throw coins in the water because every time the tide went out, they'd go through and they'd pick up all the coins. I mean, they were like dirt poor. And then we went to this school, and in this school, there were kids that were learning. It was like they all had uniforms, their hair was combed, their skin looked clean, their eyes looked white. I mean, like everything. They were the same kids. I mean, like completely the same community. But it was so crazy to see how much the Christian influence in this area from the missionaries had just changed their lives, and how these kids were going to be going to community college. They were going to be investing in their community. I mean, like they were saved. I mean, honestly, compared to where the Bajau Muslim were, this little tiny enclave of Christian missionaries. And I said to the director, I said, how come more people aren't enjoying this? How come you're not saving more of these kids? And they said, well, it's a Muslim community. They don't want their kids coming to a Christian school. And so I lost it. I remember we were playing songs, and like I did one of these ugly cries in front of all the high school students and everything, but like it just hit me that like, God, you see this. You see what's going on, and you see the benefit of what's going on with these kids here in this Christian community. Why can't we get more kids into this? You got all these kids running around. They're not going to get any education. They're probably going to follow in the footsteps of their parents. They're going to join these fishing fleets where they're gone for months at a time. There's high rates of divorce and mistreatment and abuse. And I mean, it's just horrible. But within this Christian community, God was doing an amazing thing. And it just hit me that this world is so messed up. And I think that's where we got to start as we look at the book of Job, is that, man, the world is messed up. It's not the way it's supposed to be. You see, from the beginning, God created everything perfectly. There was this idea that God's presence would be among us. And because of his presence among us, it would change us and who we are. It would kind of complete us as individuals. And because of that communion that we had with God, there was no such thing as sin. There was no such thing as like getting our truth from something or somewhere else. We just relied on God, and there was this direct access to him. And because of what the Bible talks about with the entrance of sin, the world now is a much different place, and God's presence is removed. And so it's like everything's different. It's like it's all the same, but it's different. I mean, there's still animals and plants in the world. I mean, it's magic the way this world is set up. But because God's presence is removed, we have something called sin. And I think that's what we talk about when we talk about suffering. It's like, man, why does God allow sin to reign in this earth? And we want to look at that. Like, why does God allow bad things to happen? Because suffering just seems to be like a fact of life. It's interesting because I'm a religion guy. I like looking at different religions. I think there's a lot of truth in a lot of different religions. Big difference between having truth in the religion and having the truth. But in Buddhism, there's an interesting truth. There's this guy named Siddhartha, and he eventually becomes the Buddha. And Siddhartha, as a teenager, he goes out at night, as teenagers do. You know, he sneaks out. His father had tried to keep from him all the bad things of life, like disease, decay, death, suffering, and all that kind of thing. And he goes out at night, and for 4 nights in a row, he goes out and he sees, like, one night he sees death, one night he sees hunger, one night he sees disease, one night he sees old age. And finally he goes to his dad and he goes, like, look, how come this has been hidden from me? And the father's like, you weren't supposed to see that. I didn't want you to see any of that. And he's like, yeah, but that's really what life is. I got to figure out what that means for me. And so he goes out and he becomes the Buddha, long story short. But the whole thing of Buddhism is that life is suffering and there's nothing you can do about it. It's just the way it is. And the whole antidote to suffering in Buddhism is to cease existing. Now, Christianity is very different. Jesus has a very different message. He says that there is suffering in life, but that's not what life was meant to be. In fact, Jesus said, I am the life. Life was meant to be communion with God. And suffering comes about as a result of sin. And sometimes the suffering we suffer is a result of our own sinful choices. You know, like there are things that we do that bring about disastrous consequences in our lives. Like I remember in high school, I was kicked off the honor society because I discharged a weapon in school. So I won't get into that now. It's a horrible thing. I mean, today I'd be like in the slammer, I'm sure. But I didn't shoot anybody, but I mean, I shot the back windshield out of some dude's car. It was horrible. I'm laughing about it now, but it was like the worst thing in the world. But see, I suffered the consequences because of something I did. It was a really bad choice. Sometimes we suffer because of the sinful choices of others. Like when I was in college, I had a good friend named Kate who every now and then would just panic. She would just be panicky and she'd have to kind of talk herself down and kind of come off of it a little bit because of the way she was abused by somebody who took her on a date. And sometimes there's just suffering because the world is messed up, because of the sinful state of the world. And the fact that we have been separated from God's presence. And that's kind of like the Bajau Muslims. Now, it's interesting. We talk about like, why is there difficulty? Why is there suffering? Why is there heartache? There can be one more reason that we're walking through difficulty. And today we want to look at that. We want to look on that particular vein of like, so if we're going through a difficult time in our lives, if we're going through some suffering, is it possible, now listen, is it possible that God is testing us? So I'm not talking about things that you did that you're now suffering the consequences for. I'm not talking about when somebody did something horrible to you. I'm not even talking about the state of the world. I'm just saying sometimes God tests us. Not all difficulties are related to God's tests. Some things are, just difficult. But sometimes God does test us. And a test, now listen, a test is not the result of your personal sin or bad choices or the experience of your consequence of sin or anything like that. Sometimes God tests us because he wants us to know what we're made of. Now, in the Bible, there's a book, and it's called the Book of Job. And it's all about God testing this person that's faithful. So I want to read to you the first couple verses of Job, because it kind of sets up this unfair scenario of where God's like, all right, well, let's see what Job will do. So in Job chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, it reads like this. There once was a man named Job who lived in the land of Uz. He was blameless, a man of complete integrity. He feared God and stayed away from evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 teams of oxen, and 500 female donkeys. He also had many servants. He was, in fact, the richest person in that entire area. Job's sons would take turns preparing feasts in their homes, and they would also invite their 3 sisters to celebrate with them. When these celebrations ended, sometimes after several days, Job would purify his children. He would get up early in the morning and offer a burnt offering for each of them. For Job said to himself, "Perhaps my children have sinned and have cursed God in their hearts." This was Job's regular practice. So Job was a faithful guy. It's like you pair these two together. You've got, on the one hand, he was very rich, but he was also very, very faithful. Like he was a very devout guy. He woke up every day and offered a sacrifice for each one of his kids in case they, by chance, happened to sin and they didn't even know about it. So now it's interesting because it starts off all nice. It starts off all kind of rosy, but then it gets twisted. There's like a dark tone that comes in here in verse 6. So read with me if you would. In verse 6, it says, "One day, the members of the heavenly court came to present themselves before the Lord, and the accuser, Satan, came with them. 'Where have you come from?' the Lord asked Satan. Satan answered the Lord, 'I've been patrolling the earth, watching everything that's going on.' Then the Lord said to Satan, 'Have you noticed my servant Job? He's the finest man in all the earth. He is blameless, a man of complete integrity. He fears God and stays away from evil.' Satan replied to the Lord, 'Yes, but Job has good reason to fear God. You have always put a wall of protection around him and his home and his property. You have made him prosper in everything he does. Look how rich he is. But reach out and take away everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face.' 'All right, you may test him,' the Lord said to Satan. 'Do whatever you want with everything he possesses, but don't harm him physically.' So Satan left the Lord's presence." Now listen, there's a lot we can get into about Satan showing up in front of God and heavenly court and all that kind of thing. I don't really know much about what it means. But apparently, according to this story, God allows Job to be tested. Job loses his kids, his wealth, his standing in the community. He's got nothing left. I mean, everything is torched. It's gone. But in verse 20, it's really interesting. Job's reaction to this says in verse 20, "Job stood up, tore his robe in grief. Then he shaved his head and fell to the ground in worship. And he said, 'I came naked from my mother's womb, and I will be naked when I leave. The Lord gave me what I had, and the Lord has taken it away. Praise the name of the Lord.'" And in verse 22, it says, "In all of this, Job did not sin by blaming God." So, you read through something like this and you think to yourself, so why would God do this? Why would God allow this to happen? So there's a couple of perspectives on this that we want to look at. Either we have one life, and it's like you only live once, and so, man, why would God do that? He messed up everything. And if you're only thinking, man, we only live once and there's nothing after this life, and it's just kind of, man, you're messing with a masterpiece, look, you had everything so nice, then yeah, what God's doing is horrible. But if you think of the idea of eternal life, that God is testing us and preparing us for something else, it seems like a wise thing to do. For example, if you're messing with somebody who's got a good thing going and they're in sixth grade, and you kind of say, look, we're going to clip your wings a little bit here and we're going to test you and see if you can stand up under the pressure of this, knowing that there's like high school and college and you're going to have kids someday and all the rest of it. That seems like a wise thing to do. But if all you live in is middle school for the rest of your life, that's a torturous and horrible thing to do. Do you get what I mean? I mean, like if this is all there is to life, is just this life, then God's horrible, testing people and seeing how they react. But if there's something beyond this, and if there's something that God's preparing us for in eternity, then tests make the most sense. Tests are not God playing games with our lives. Testing is never about God's knowledge. It's never about, well, I wonder what it'll do. It's always about ours. It's us realizing how we can react in certain situations and how we can develop our character. In Job chapter 1, we see God who is open to allowing us to go through trials, to see what will happen, and to see how we'll respond. And since God already knows everything, the trial or the test isn't about him discovering our response. It's about us. Perhaps what you're going through is designed to test your faith, and it's getting you ready for something difficult in the future. I mean, in the same way that you lift weights and it's not fun and it's miserable while you're doing it and it hurts you, it makes you stronger. See, testing is never enjoyable to go through, but it makes you stronger in the long run. I watched this documentary one time. Arnold Schwarzenegger, he's like one of the best all-time weightlifters in the world, Mr. Atlas, Mr. Universe, so many times. I mean, he's just like this huge guy. And there's this guy who is not exactly Mr. Huge, but he was in like Arnold's weight class or whatever. He's like, man, my arms, they just hurt so bad from working out. And he goes, oh, your arms, they hurt. And I was like, yeah, it really hurts. Oh, it's good. When it hurts, it grows. So translation, if it hurts, it grows. If something hurts, it's going to grow. Now listen, you might be in a test right now. You might have some difficulty that you're going through right now. It doesn't have to do with any of your sin or the sin of others. It might just be that God is attempting to strengthen you. That God is attempting to translate that hurt into growth. I mean, that might be where you are right now. And so, so what do we do? How do we cope with that? Like, what are some strategies for enduring the trial that you find yourself in right now? Now, when you get into groups later, I want you to figure out whether you're in a trial, because you got to figure out if you are in a trial, because you might just be suffering the consequences for doing something stupid, okay? Or you might be suffering the consequences of somebody else's sin. But if it's not any of that, you might be right in the middle of a test right now. And so look, here's some strategies for how you can get through a test. First of all, we are built this way in terms of Connect. We're all about groups. And I think one of the best ways, and Job does this, we'll read further on in Job, where he leans into his group. He leans into the people that come and sit with him. And notice, they come and sit for days with him. And what's fascinating, it's like a Hebrew concept, it's called sitting Shiva, where it's like you sit 7. You sit with that person for 7 days and you just listen. Now, some of Job's friends gave some suggestions, and some of them are good, some of them are not so good. But the group is most important. When you're going through a test, when you're going through a difficulty, you got to reach out for people. And that's why we don't do life alone. That's why you got to reach out to your group. You got to be vulnerable with them and say, look, I'm going through a tough time right now. And particularly what you got to do within that group, you got to find one person that you can open up to and depend on. One person that you can send that text to and be like, look, I'm really struggling with this right now. I think in the midst of that too, a great strategy is to keep a journal of your prayers, keep a journal of the events that are going on. You know what's so great about journals too, is that if you're writing down your thoughts on the rest of the pages, if on the inside flap, if you can write down your prayer request, write down the date of your prayer request, and then when those prayers get answered, write down the date that they're answered, because then you can see how faithful God is. When you open up the inside flap, you can say, I prayed about this and it happened here, prayed about this and it happened here, and I prayed about this and it's not yet, but I know from these other things, God is faithful. Another strategy for how to keep going in the midst of a test: stay away from tempting situations that lure you into sin. Job had a wife later who comes to him and says, why don't you just curse God and die? Like, he needed to stay away from her because she was giving him some really tempting material to want to just give up on everything. And so maybe for you, if you're going through a test right now and it's very easy to like walk away from God, or at least to say, well, if I'm going to go through this right now, then I might as well go get blasted. I might as well go out with some friends and just live up a little bit, or I might as well go over here and engage in this, or might as well, all these things that are feeling tempting to want to go do. As long as God's punishing you, then you might as well go do something. You want to stay away from tempting situations like that. You want to let some people know in your group, like, hey, I'm going to be tempted to do these things. You want to get to bed early. You don't want to stay up late. The more you stay up late, the more your mind wanders, the more texts you send that you shouldn't have sent, the more places you wander on the internet you should have never wandered. So you want to kind of remain in a schedule that keeps you focused and locked on the test at hand. And you know what? Another strategy is this: don't woe is me everything. Look, seek someone to reach out to in the midst of this. It's funny, you think like, well, no, I'm going through suffering right now. I'm going through a difficult time. No, actually, having other problems to sort out sometimes helps to put yours in perspective. I remember I was struggling with something in college and I met with my discipler and he's like, hey, we're going to go out and talk to people about Jesus today. I'm like, I'm not going to talk to anybody about Jesus today. I got this massive thing in front of me. And he looked at me and he goes, John, some of the best time to immerse yourself in other people and other people's problems is when you've got a problem. Because when you help other people work out their problems, it helps put yours in perspective. And so don't make this into a pity party where it's like, oh my gosh, for the next 6 weeks, everything's about you. And you bring your group into this swirling vortex of me. Everything's about me. Maybe you need to be focusing on some other people during this time because it might help you understand what's going on in your own test. Listen, A test is not about how you come out of it. It's how you go through it. You can't fail a test that you go through. Now think through your difficulty right now. Could it be a test from God? And how are you doing? How can you see growth in this and from this in the long term? And what do you have to do to get yourself in a position to ride this out, to lean on God as an act of faith, and to lean on others? Now listen, as I dismiss you to groups, I want you to think through a couple things. First, I want you to determine if, in fact, what you're going through right now is a test or is it just a consequence of sin? Is it a consequence of your own sin or a sin of other people? If it's not, maybe it is a test. And I want you to think through that. And I also want you to determine if you're willing to invest the faith in keeping the faith. I've given you a couple strategies. I've given you hopefully a bunch of thoughts for you to poke with. I want to pray for you right now so that as you get into groups, you can focus on that one thing that you're struggling with, and you can rely on your group to pass this test. So God, I pray for every person watching this right now. I pray that as we think through the things that are really difficult right now, and God, I know so many things I've been through that have just been tests in the long run. I pray that you would help them to have just the guts right now, maybe a little bit of the fortitude to say, Lord, I decide to trust in you. And God, if this is a test from you, I want to come through it and I want to have faith. I pray, Lord, that each person watching this would have the transparency to open up to the people in their group and to share some of this burden so that they can come through this test and realize that you were growing us all the time. And in the midst of this hurt, that we can see growth. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.